When the KJV uses italics, doesn't that mean that the King James translators were improperly adding words that shouldn't have been included? Let me say that again. The King James Bible has italics, and those italics indicate words that were added by the translators. Isn't that clear evidence that the King James translators were doing something they shouldn't do? Doesn't that show that they were adding to the Word of God? Well, if you've been watching this program for any period of time, you know that I'm not going to say that the King James Bible has errors, because it simply doesn't. Here's what's going on, and it really is rather a simple explanation. The King James translators were scrupulously honest. When there was a word in the text that they produced, the King James text, that was not based on an underlying Greek or Hebrew word, they put it in italics. In other words, when they were looking at the Greek text or the Hebrew text, and then they were translating it into English, if they ever added a word that wasn't in the original manuscripts that they had, the copies that they had, they would put the word in italics. Now you may say, well, doesn't that sound like they're adding to the Word of God? The reality is this: when you translate from one language to another language, you sometimes have to add words that were not in the original language to give the proper sense in the receptor language. That's what they were doing. They weren't just adding their own opinions. They weren't just adding random words for no reason. They were adding words that were necessary to give the sense of what the Greek and Hebrew manuscripts said. Now, by the way, that's a common practice. That's not simply something that the King James translators did. Other translators do that as well. So when you see italics in the King James, you shouldn't think to yourself, well, those words probably shouldn't be there. You might wonder to yourself, why don't other translators put the words they supply in italics? Wouldn't that be the more straightforward, transparent way to do things? So there's nothing wrong with the words in italics in the King James. They're perfectly fine. But I thought I would show you one very fascinating example that it'd just be interesting for you to see. So if we take 1 John chapter 2, verse 23, you'll see the verse as it is written in the King James. Whosoever denieth the Son, the same hath not the Father, but he that acknowledgeth the Son hath the Father also. The part that I've highlighted in yellow, that entire clause is in italics. I put it in yellow because I wasn't sure if you could see it. But if you pick up your King James Bible and you look at 1 John 2:23, this entire section is in italics. And the reason it was in italics is that phrase, that clause, did not appear in the Greek manuscripts that were available to the King James translators. Now, what you might think to yourself is, you might think, well, wait a minute, that's not just supplying a single word so that the verse makes sense. It's supplying this entire thought. How do they do that? Well, here's the explanation. When the King James translators were translating the King James, they had a lot more sources than just simply Greek manuscripts and Hebrew manuscripts. They had other sources that were available to them, and they knew that this was part of 1 John 2, verse 23, so it was proper for them to include it. But they were scrupulously honest. So what they did is, since this language did not appear in the Greek manuscripts that they had, they put it in italics. They were being completely straightforward. Now, I want you to notice one more slide. This is the NIV. None of this is in italics. And if you notice, the NIV has a phrase that says essentially the exact same thing as what the King James says. In other words, those words are proper. They were part of the original Greek text. They should be there. So let me sum it up by simply saying this. The italics in the King James are not something for you to worry about. They're not something to be concerned about. It's simply the King James translators revealing their work. They're showing these words were words that we supplied because they were not in the Greek and Hebrew manuscripts that we had. It's not suggesting that the words shouldn't be there. It's not suggesting that the words are there in error.